next topic that we are going to address today, our third session, is titled Abstinence and the Blessing of Children in a Pro-Abortion Society. And we are going to have the Very Reverend Fr.John Peck with us. Again, we're very happy, Father John, to have you here with us at our parish again. Father John is here from Phoenix, Arizona area. A friend of ours, a budding brotherly love, between the Cariot clergy and Father John. We're hoping to work with him more closely in the very near future. Father John has an incredibly active ministry via the internet. He runs several blogs. Journey to Orthodoxy, Good Guys Wear Black, the Preacher's Institute, what else? Permaculture USA, many. And as I've told you before, he has through Journey to Orthodoxy, he is bringing literally dozens of people to the Orthodox faith from around the world via his ability to communicate with them through the blogs, through internet, through email, using technology. Thank God for a godly purpose. And so please welcome warmly Father John Peck.
Esteemed fathers, brothers, visitors, guests, I think I have the short straw. After lunch is when the food coma. And they do beckon. So I want to get right to the point of my topic. The topic is abstinence and the blessing of children in a pro-abortion society. And the fathers and I were talking in between and noticing that our talks overlap and dovetail in several areas. Well, why should that be a surprise? We're not creative theologically as Orthodox. We stick with the tradition, which itself is an infinite source of reality. Ontology is the study of reality. And in fact, St. Basil says, what is the afterlife like? It's the contemplation of reality. It's the vision of reality, how things really are. And we live in a lot of myths and fantasy. And I want to dispel some of those in my talk. And I want to start with the first one, which is I think it's a product of the sexual revolution, and that is the idea that sex is special. Sex isn't special. It's common. Well, am I wrong? It's as common as brushing your teeth. People are engaged in it by the millions right now. It's not special. There's nothing special about sex. Nothing. Not one thing. It's very common. So getting out of the way the idea that this is something special, because things that are special people want to get, like apples in the garden, right? Not really an apple, I know. You know why the fruit in the garden was considered to be an apple? The Latin word for apple is the same as the Latin word for evil, malus. So it was the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and apples, good and evil. They just assumed, because of that, those that knew Latin, that it was an apple. It was considered a fig and a pomegranate at different times in history, but nobody knows what it really was. You shouldn't eat it, though. Now, I want to work backwards a little bit here. We do live in a precarious time. It is a dark time. It's a dark time for Christians. It's okay. We're used to that. It's a dark time for morality. Dehumanization, correctly pointed out, is the tool of the enemy. The Nazis considered Jews to be subhuman. It's not a baby, it's a ball of cells. It's not a heartbeat, it's a heart tone. Look, those are the things that people are told, right? And the Nazis also considered the Armenians and the Slavs to all be subhuman. They're just animals, they're just pigs, whatever. This is a common theme in history. And Christians facing a pro-abortion society is exactly the lap into which Christianity was dropped as a newborn faith. And I actually want to talk about that. It's not today's society. As if we were doing something new, Father rightly pointed out, this isn't new. The world in which Christians immediately and recognizably found themselves did not believe in abstinence or the blessing of children, but they did believe in abortion. And this is the thesis of my talk, right here. We have forgotten how deep a cultural revolution Christianity has wrought. We can't recognize it anymore. We forget it precisely because of how deep it was. There are many ideas that we simply take for granted as natural and obvious when in fact they didn't exist until the arrival of Christianity changed things completely. So let's start. One particular trait that set Christians apart from everyone else in the world. In the first century, when Christianity was still in its infancy, the Greco-Roman world paid no attention to it because there were lots of little cults doing weird little things. It was seen under the Jewish umbrella, and that was kind of a weird thing by itself. Little Semitic tribes doing their thing. They took religion very seriously, though. Just another group of monotheists in increasingly cosmopolitan culture. But in the second century, the Christianity emerged with a distinctive religious identity in the view of the public, and the surrounding pagan culture did begin to take notice, and it didn't like what it saw. Personally, and I'm speaking for myself, and don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, but I've always admired the Roman emperor, the empire, for his insight and intuition. There were lots of monotheists technically in the Roman Empire, and they were left alone, but Christians had to be destroyed. From the very beginning, the power behind what the Roman Empire had become understood from the very start that it was a fight to the death. That this small group, which no longer escaped detection, had to be destroyed. And I think it's because the power behind the Roman culture recognized in Christianity its truest and bitterest enemy. And from that moment forward, it was a no-holds-barred fight to the death. We won. I'm going to tell you how we won. It's probably not what you're thinking. We were seen as strange and superstitious, a peculiar religious movement that undermined the norms of decent society. Okay, now, when I say decent society, we have a pretty good idea what that is, right? And we understand what it is in human history, right? No. It's a myth. Suddenly, Christians were everywhere. They were in the army, they were in the legion, they were in the markets, they were in the imperial household. And what exactly was so different about them? Let's put aside myth and things we were taught in government schools. One trait was that Christians would not pay homage to other gods, including in business deals. The way you concluded a business deal was you made an oath to the god. It was called a sacramentum. You both put earnest money forward. And if somebody broke the deal, you got your money back. But the loser's money went to the public coffers. Guess where that went? To the temples. That's why they were rich. But you had to swear by one of the gods. And there was a lot of variety in which gods you would swear to: Apollo, Castor, or Pollux. Women could only swear by Castor. Men would only swear by Pollux. Male, female, that sort of thing. But there was a second trait that separated Christians from pagan culture. Something so profound and revolutionary that, again, we no longer recognize how different and powerful an idea it was. And when I say it to you, you'll go, huh? Our sexual ethic. Thank you. Thanks for that. It was not unusual for Roman citizens to have multiple sexual partners, homosexual encounters, regular liaisons with temple prostitutes, the priestesses, and unrestrained contact with concubines, servants, slaves, and sometimes children, and sometimes their own children, which was not uncommon. I'll prove it in a minute. Christians stood out precisely because they refused to engage in any of these practices. The 2nd century apologist Tertullian went to great lengths to defend Christianity by pointing out that Christians are generous and share their goods with all those in need. But then he said, "We are one in mind and soul. We do not hesitate to share our earthly goods with one another and all things in common, but our wives." Yeah, that doesn't seem unusual to us. That was revolutionary. Nobody did that. Why did he say it? Because in the ancient world, wife swapping was common. It was common. It was as common as sex is. That common. So when we talk about decent society, it ain't what it used to be. The 2nd century epistle to Diognetus, the author went out of his way to declare that Christians are normal in what they wear, what they eat, how they participate in society, unlike a lot of mystery cults. But then he said that Christians share their meals, but not their sexual partners. Again, this made Christians not only different, very different. Again, 2nd century, just as Christians are coming to the public view, the apologists are defending Christians to the authorities. The 2nd century apology of Aristides defends the Christian faith to the Emperor Hadrian by pointing out that Christians do not commit adultery or fornication. Nobody asked them why. They were astonished that they did it. And the final example comes from, again, a 2nd century apologist, Minucius Felix, in his defense to Octavius. There's a name you might recognize. He contrasted the sexual ethic of the pagan world with that of the Christian. And please indulge me by letting me read this section. Among the Persians, a promiscuous association between sons and mothers is allowed. No big deal. Marriages with sisters are legitimate among the Egyptians and in Athens. Your records and your tragedies, which you both read and hear with pleasure, glory in incest. Thus you worship incestuous gods. You have intercourse with mothers and daughters and sisters. Incest frequently detected by you and is continually permitted. You miserable men, you scatter your lust so promiscuously and astray to your own offspring. Thus you continue the story of incest, even although you have no consciousness of your crime. But we maintain our modesty, not in appearance, but in our heart. We gladly abide by the bond of a single marriage. In the desire of procreating, we know either one wife or none at all. Clearly, one of the main ways Christians stood out from their surrounding culture was their distinctive sexual behavior. They abstained from sexual intercourse with everyone but their own lawful spouse, and they only had one. What kind of revolution is that? Needless to say, this history has tremendous implications for Christians today. We are reminded again that what we're experiencing in the present is not new. Christians battled an oversexed culture as early as the 1st and 2nd century. But it is also a reminder why Christians must not go along with the constantly changing, shifting goalposts of sexual norms in our world. To do so would not only violate the clear teachings of Scripture, it would also rob us of one of our greatest witnessing opportunities. Inasmuch as marriage reflects Christ's love for the church, Christians' commitment to marriage is a means of proclaiming that love. In the end, Christianity triumphed in its early Greco-Roman context, not because it was the same as the surrounding pagan culture, but because it was so different. Now you might say, well, Father, what about the Old Testament? What about the Jews? Weren't they also following the same kind of sexual ethic? Even a cursory reading of the Old Testament demonstrates clearly that neither the Torah, nor the histories, nor the Psalms, nor the prophets forbid a man from having multiple wives. Abraham did it, Jacob did it, David did it, Solomon did it, and some of them had thousands of wives. It's a lot of anniversaries to remember. These notable examples of big biblical figures who wedded more than one wife, and in most cases many more, make us ask the question, well, when did monotheism become part of Judaism? Well, I know that answer, and I'm going to share it with you right now. About 1,000 years ago in Germany, the noted German scholar Rabbi Gershon banned polygamy among his many reforms on Jewish life. Those who transgressed were liable to be socially excommunicated, despite the fact that this was a common thing in biblical times and commonly seen in the Old Testament because of Christian influence. Today, a new organization in Israel among Orthodox Jews is trying to reinstate polygamy into mainstream Judaism. Despite it being against the contemporary norm of Jewish custom, we have to say custom because it's not against their law, and it is prohibited by the state of Israel. It is, they say, a solution to the dearth of Jewish males and an abundance of Jewish females in the Jewish population. They don't want them mentoring the women marrying Gentiles. They want them marrying Jews. So again, I want to remind you, we've forgotten just how deep a cultural revolution Christianity has wrought. I'm going to say that a couple times for stress sake, But strict devotion to monogamy is not the most profound thing which Christianity brought to society. Christianity has invented something absolutely unique in human history. I'm talking about our faith's most subtle, most powerful, and most profound invention. Anybody want to take a guess? It's not a rhetorical question. If you have something, throw it out.
Abstinence.
Salvation, abstinence,
Family.
family. Not bad, but no. Our faith's most profound invention. And again, you're going to have to listen to what I explain to understand what I mean, is the idea of children. Today we simply take it for granted that the innocence and vulnerability of our children makes them beings of particular value, entitled to particular care. We romanticize children, their beauty, their joy, their liveliness. Our culture encourages us to let ourselves fall prey to the gooey feelings whenever we look at baby pictures on Facebook. And what in the world could be more natural? This is an historical oddity. Those who survived the torture and despair of concentration camps during World War II and the Soviet era, when asked about the most depressing thing about being in a concentration camp, almost always replied the lack of children. Not being able to see children, to us, represents despair. And children represent hope in a way that nothing else does. But again, this view of children is an historical oddity. Let's look back at the view of children that prevailed in Europe's ancient pagan world. And by the way, I'm not inventing this myself. I'm taking this from historical sociologists and other historians. As the historian O.M. Baki points out in his book, when children became people, in ancient Greece and Rome and throughout the Fertile Crescent, children were considered non-persons, only potentially human. Does that sound familiar? It's what the slaveholders in the South and throughout Europe said about their African slaves, who, by the way, were almost all Christian. Same was said of the Jews, Armenians, and Slavs by the Nazi state and their propaganda. Don't even get me started on what Islam says. Today, feminist and pro-abortion lobbies, support groups, and political machines all declare the fetus is not a human person. And soon that a child is not a human person. Therefore not entitled to legal protection or rights, and even endangered species of animals have protections under our law. The fathers of the church say just the opposite. Remember I said we were going to repeat themes here because we've been reading the same stuff? They admit no distinction, the hair-splitting distinction between an unformed and a fully formed child in the womb. It's another word you never hear abortion talk about. They never say the word womb. It's a holy word, that's why. By contrast, many pagan authors describe children as being more like, and I quote, plants than human beings. This attitude has concrete consequences. Take, for example, the Canaanite god Moloch, from the word melech, which means king. If I pronounce that wrong, I apologize. from which we get the word Melkite, for example. Moloch was a bronze statue heated with fire to which the victims were thrown. But Moloch was not just a local Canaanite phenomenon. He had been associated with the child sacrifices of Carthage to Baal-Hamon, the chief god of Carthage. Recent archaeological excavations, big words here, have produced solid evidence for child sacrifice in Carthage, as well as inscriptions including the name Moloch. The Israelite worship of Moloch wasn't abolished. The Israelite worship of Moloch wasn't abolished until the Babylonian captivity. Babylonian religion was pantheistic, and it included astrology and divination, but they did not practice human sacrifice. In this, they were superior to the Jews. Plutarch, you may have heard of him, an important philosophical, historical figure, wrote in his work, The Superstitions, quote, with full knowledge and understanding that they offered themselves up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without a tear or a moan, but if she should utter a single moan or let fall a single tear, she would forfeit the money, and the child would be sacrificed anyway. And the whole area before the statue was filled with the loud noise of flutes and drums, that the cries of wailing should not reach the ears of the people. Moloch was a bull-headed god made of bronze, with its arms outstretched like this. And underneath was a brazier they would light a fire until it was glowing, and that's where they would set the child. Not one at a time. Diodorus relates that when Agathocles defeated Carthage, the Carthaginian nobles believed they had displeased Moloch by substituting the low-born children for their own children. Listen to what their concern is. They attempted to make amends by sacrificing 200 children of the best families all at once. And in their enthusiasm, they actually sacrificed 300 children. This sounds like the setting to a bad Hercules movie. But this actually happened. This was common. Not just in Canaan, Carthage, throughout the Middle East. This was a cultural norm that everyone accepted. How could this be allowed to happen? That was decent society. We forget the revolution, how deep the revolution that Christianity has wrought. Today, due to the revolutionary influence of Christianity, civilized people can no longer even tolerate the thought of these things. In the ancient world, according to historical sociologists, the entire social worldview was undergirded by an implicit approach, a universally held but not very much talked about idea, which is society was organized according to concentric circles of importance and value. In the center was the freeborn male, and outside that, the manumitted males, former slave, and then the foreigner, and then I think there were slaves, and then women, and then children. So this was on the outside. And everybody's value depended on how close you were to that freeborn adult male. That was the lot of everyone. And in spite of what we see in Hollywood movies, well-to-do and wealthy parents of the ancient world typically did not even interact with their own children, leaving them to be raised by slaves. Severe beatings were a regular part of an education. And in Rome, again, I have to repeat it, a father had the right to kill his child for whatever reason, and if it was a male, he could only do it up until the male became a man. He was like 12 or 15. What a great reason to get into puberty. You made it. You're free. But until that time, nobody thought twice about it. Kill your child, so what? Make another one. One of the most notorious practices of the ancient world that Christianity rebelled against from the very beginning was the frequent practice of expositio, which we get the word exposition from, and that is the abandonment of a child outside the wall. Girls were abandoned much more often than boys, of course, which meant that Roman society had an extremely one-sided gender ratio, and anybody who does any historical research will tell you, demographic research, when the demography of males and females shifts toward males, too many males, everybody goes to war. There's a constant tension. And it's not just sexual tension. It's a tension of existence. Yeah. I know it's funny to say, but it's a real thing. In Rome, and by extension, in the ancient world, most sexual acts were permissible, as long as they involved a person of higher status dominating a person of lower status. This meant that according to all the evidence we have, the sexual abuse of children, especially boys, was out of control. This demonic practice in the ancient world was regular, common, and accepted. It is sometimes pointed to paganism's greater tolerance, though no means full acceptance of homosexuality, than Christianity's as evidence for its higher moral standing, but nothing could be further from the truth. And this is to look at a world we no longer can even imagine through exceptionally distorted lenses. But lest we blame the Romans alone for this, it was not a uniquely Roman idea, and it wasn't just the Spartans that would discard their malformed children or their runts. The ancient Mesopotamians, going back as far as 3000 BC, that we can tell by historical records, likewise valued the free-born adult male above all of others. Women were mostly property, and children could be abandoned, killed, or sold into slavery at any time. A malformed infant was considered an evil omen. So before you disposed of one of those, you had to go through a particular ritual and then throw their body in the river. Omen collections and magical texts, which were held in high regard, carefully describe infant and childhood diseases, but in their medical texts, which prescribe treatments, there is not one mention of a single treatment of a disease or an injury for a child. Most abandoned children died. Children that were set outside the wall to die, most of them were rescued. And here's where it gets worse. They were almost always raised as slaves. And the most profitable way for a small child slave to earn money was as a sex slave. Brothels specializing in child sex slaves, particularly boys, were established as completely legal and thriving businesses in ancient Rome. There was no social stigma about it at all. The rich didn't have to bother with brothels. They had all the rights to abuse their slaves and even their own children as they pleased. And this, brethren, is the world into which Christianity came, condemning abortion, condemning infanticide as loudly and as early as it could. This is the world into which Christianity came, calling attention to children and ascribing special worth to them. But really, Christianity's invention of children, that is, its invention of the cultural idea that children as precious and treasured human beings, was an outgrowth of its most radical, unacceptable, and revolutionary idea, which is today still unacceptable. The idea of the radical equality and infinite value of every single human being as a beloved child of God. We can look at ancient Greece and say they believed in equality, yes, for free-born males. Everybody else had less value, and they did not have equality. The Persians couldn't tolerate that because they had a god emperor, and he was not equal to a slave. But Christians, some of whom were slaves, they were equal. Completely equal. If the God who made heaven and earth chose to reveal himself not as an emperor, but as a poor man, shamefully punished on the cross, then no one could claim higher value than anyone else on the basis of earthly status. This idea that children were something special, precious, and inherently valuable was so revolutionary an idea, and it changed human culture so much that we can't even recognize the ancient world when we read about it. And here we are today, once again in a pro-abortion society that sees Christianity as odd, peripheral, dangerous, sexual perversion struggling to find its way to acceptance by any means necessary, pedophilia excused as a culturally acceptable practice, and that those who strike out to protect their victims arrested as criminals. Children as less than human. Out-of-control sexual practice is encouraged and considered unrestrainable. How often we hear people in Hollywood say, I don't think monogamy is really natural. That's not a new idea either. That's normalcy in human history. We're the abnormal ones. Congratulations. It's a badge to wear with honor. Now, don't get me wrong. It is a dark time for Christians. It is a dark time for our nation. But America's transition to a pagan, secularist, or socialist state is not complete and by no means a bygone conclusion. The last election demonstrated that the cultural revolution which Christianity has wrought remains deeply seated in Western civilization, which, by the way, Western civilization is another enemy of our enemy, because it's based on Christianity. Nature abhors a vacuum. And as the scripture says, where there is no vision, the people perish. But that's only half the quote. And you know, as Orthodox Christians, we don't like half quotes. We like context. The full verse in Proverbs 29:18 is, where there is no vision, the people perish, but blessed is he who keeps the law. The prophetic vision of the church is what the enemy wants to destroy. We have a particular vision of human existence. Without prophetic vision, the world loses its soul and always afterwards its mind. When falsehood, fantasy, and imagination take the place of reality, violence, civil violence particularly, always follows. If you've ever wondered why we never had people burning at the stake, why we didn't have an inquisition and stuff, heresy is about falsehood. And civil violence always follows heresy. You can always find it. You can always see it historically. Now, in the first century document, the Didache, which all three of us have quoted from, and it's short, it's super short, the first Christian catechism, this book is responsible for me becoming Orthodox. Because I was reading it as a heterodox Christian, and I asked myself, is anybody still doing this? It says Christians don't fast on Monday and Thursday, but we fast on Wednesday and Friday. We are? Who's doing that? Is anybody still doing that? Well, there is only one group still doing that. And it starts with these words. These are the first words of this catechism written from the first century, 70 AD, right around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. There are two ways, one of life and one of death, and there is a very great difference between the two ways. There are not 5 ways, or 6, or 8, or 45. There's 2. And there's a big difference between them. There are no 50 shades of gray. There are no shades of gray in this. This document lists, and I'm repeating the fathers here, fornication, adultery, and abortion among the ways of death. This has never been unclear to Christians, and it never will be. We know the difference between the way of life and the way of death. Either the church breathes life into society, or the church goes silent and safely irrelevant. Society devours itself and disintegrates into lawless, unrestrained passion, leaving mankind little more than animalistic, and all but incapable of free action, dependent on instinct alone. Our commitment to our Lord, to the way of life, and to holy living is the cornerstone of godly revolution. So profound and so deep, even we don't recognize how fast it all changed. How deep it has become. We've done it for 2,000 years with success. The solution to the problems of a pro-abortion society are abstinence, recognizing the blessing of children. Plain and simple. The problem is the solution. We know what to do. Even Hollywood knows what to do. And I want to end with an unusual quote, the last part of my talk here. How many people here have seen the movie The 10 Commandments? How many used to see it on TV every year? All right. How many had the DVD? VHS. I actually don't know if this is on the VHS, but this was never aired on TV. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Before the movie premiered, Cecil B. DeMille himself walked out in front of a microphone before the movie begins, and he says this: "Ladies and gentlemen, young and old, this may seem an unusual procedure, speaking to you before the picture begins, but we have an unusual subject. The story of the birth of freedom. The story of Moses. The theme of this picture is whether men ought to be ruled by God's laws or whether they are to be ruled by the whims of a dictator like Ramses. Are men property of the state, or are they free souls under God? This same battle continues throughout the world today." That was 1956. Has anything changed? No, nothing has changed. The revolution which Christianity is not unattainable. We're doing it. We're doing it quietly. We're doing it consistently. We're doing it successfully. We aren't losing this fight. If we want to, we don't have to change our culture. We don't have to transform our culture. We have to save it. And all we have to do to save it is treasure our children. And everything that means. Treasure every child. Treasure every person, no matter how disturbed, wounded, out of their mind with grief they are. Be devoted to our own spouses. One spouse. Practice a little abstinence. Because it's not by might, nor by power that things get done, but by the Spirit of God. Thanks for laughing at my jokes.